Anyway, good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. Specifically, I want to thank her for her recent rather incredible contribution of $10 million to our endowment fund. Plus a pledge of up to $5 million in matching grants. So, if any of you have a little change to spare, the Leon Levy Foundation will match your grant up to an amount of $5 million. So, for instance, if you give us $1 million, we'll name one of the fellowships after you. You can talk to me after this event to discuss this fabulous opportunity. I have to make this pitch. I mean, this money is sitting there on the table just asking to be taken. Please note that our next event will be on Tuesday, May 20th at 6:30 p.m. when former fellow James Rome will be in conversation with Adam Kirch about his new biography of Plato. If you have not done so already, please register your email address on our website so that we can notify you of our future events. But tonight I am delighted to welcome another recent fellow, Dan Nadel, to discuss his biography of a great cartoonist, Robert Crumb. Dan will be in conversation with Elisabeth Sherman. I want to say that I was so delighted to open the New York Times last Sunday to see that Dan had taken over not only the cover of the book review, but 2 full pages inside the review. It is so good to see a hard-working biographer rewarded with such lavish attention. Dwight Garner gave the book a glowing review. Quote, "Crumb, A Cartoonist's Life is a definitive and ideal biography." Whoa. Pound for pound, one of the sleekest and most judicious I've ever read. Nadel is an instinctive storyteller, one with a command of the facts and a relaxed tone that also happens to be grainy, penetrating, interested in everything alive. He knows exactly when and how long to pause and tweezer in background information, a skill that flummoxes so many biographers. This is incredible praise.
That's for saying it out loud.
It just does not get better than this. Dan is a former fellow of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. His previous books include It's Life as I See It, Black Cartoonists in Chicago, 1940 to 1980, Peter Saul, Professional Artist Correspondence, 1945-76, and Art of Time, Unknown Comic Visionaries. Nadel has curated exhibitions for galleries and museums internationally, including the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Manetti Shrem Museum of Art, UC Davis, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. He is founder of Picture Box, a publishing and packaging company that produced over 100 books, objects, and zines. Zines? Zines. From 2000 to 2014, including the Grammy Award-winning design for Wilco's 2004 album, A Ghost is Born. I hadn't known that, Dan. Incredible. Dan is curator at large for the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. He lives in Brooklyn with his family. Elisabeth Sherman is the senior curator and director of exhibitions and collections at the International Center of Photography. She has curated exhibits including ICP at 50 from the collection 1845 to 2019, David Seidner Fragments, the first New York City survey of multidisciplinary artist Muriel Haspin. Sherman joined ICP from the Whitney Museum of American Art, where she curated and co-curated numerous exhibitions, including Dawood Bey, An American Project, and Making Craft and Art, and the Whitney's presentation of Zoe Leonard survey. Dan and Elisabeth will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our in-person audience. This event is being live streamed, so hello out there to our virtual audience. Dan will be signing books at the conclusion of this event. Over there are piles of books. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Elisabeth, I now turn the conversation over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kai. After those embarrassing introductions.
It's like a bar mitzvah.
Well, you just had one.
Yeah,
so.
that's true.
Thank you all for being here. This is a real treat for me, and without starting off too personally, there are so many reasons I'm both totally surprised and totally overjoyed to be sitting in this room with this person right now. So thank you for indulging me. I actually think following your biography, it sort of bumps up or reorients a question that I wanted to start with, which was, I was going to start with why Robert, why now? But maybe before that, why a biography when this is not previously how your work has taken form?
Well, that's a good question. A while ago, when I was sort of at a crossroads, so to speak, trying to figure out what to do, I realized I really wanted to write long form about comics. I had done a bunch of, anthologies or history books, and it hadn't really scratched the itch that I wanted to scratch. And for my entire life, I've been an enormous biography reader. So it's sort of one of my favorite genres, or maybe my favorite genre. And it's the way I've learned the most about art and music and design was always through biographies, like the biography of Neil Young, which is just this incredible picture of 1970s and 80s California and recording technology and art, or like the John Richardson Picasso 3-volume biography. Just you learn the whole scope of post-1900 art. So when I was thinking about what to do, I was thinking about a biography, and also because there were a handful of biographies of cartoonists that had just come out around starting in like 09, 10, 11, and they were good. And none of them did exactly what I thought was really important, which was to talk a lot about the visuals and the process of making the things that we look at. You read comics, but you also look at them. So I wanted something sort of fine-grained about that, about these people who make these things and how they do it. And Crumb was a long-standing fascination. And I knew that I could write about the history of comics through him, because he's not rare. There's a handful of cartoonists like Crumb. I mean, you could talk about like Gary Panter or Chris Ware, handful of others or Seth, who are unbelievable students of the medium and who were both active in comics and making groundbreaking comics, but also reintroducing all sorts of comics and art to a broader readership in some cases, or a niche readership if it was the underground. And Robert was one of those people who was always sort of mentioning things, but also somebody who was always gathering people around him and kind of creating groups. Even if he's not at all a natural leader, he is a natural kind of community former. Builder is too strong a word. Magnet. So I just thought, okay, here's something to do. I could write a biography of him and say so much about the history of comics and America through that lens. And that's how. It's a strange thing, because I didn't even realize until I applied for Leon Levy, I hadn't really thought about it as a world of people writing biographies. I just thought, I'll just do that thing over there, which is sort
Sometimes
of...
it's better not to know.
Yeah, and that's often. I rarely ever know. Yeah, I just kind of do the thing over there.
Well, then maybe before getting to your subject, because it's something maybe I found really strongly in the book, in fact, in the many quotes I brought along just in case, you know, in your introduction, you write beautifully, why don't we just read it? You say, Robert's specific guttural yelp has long since placed him among the most profound and influential artists of the 20th century, and could only have come from someone born of, as he named it, America the cruel bully, America the glutton, America the greedy, America the ugly. And I think hearing how you came to this and thinking what reading history, the individual auteur, what this does for me is that these windows into who we are, where we are, how we got here. And I will say this is not a question, but I've profoundly felt that at the end of this book, that I understood a trajectory of the late 20th century in a different way.
Yeah, it's that came sort of through the writing. I didn't set out. I started to realize after talking to Robert for a couple years and talking to everybody around him, and in particular Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb, to whom he was married. I started to realize, Aileen said something really important to me. She said two really amazing things that kind of, you know, when you're doing something and you kind of feel a switch turn, and then it's like, oh, this pathway is open now. Aileen said, one, she said, people, you know, when you're young, people really imprint on you. And like that's something, of course, we know, but when she said it to me at age 70, and we were talking about people she had met in 1966, it just opened something up about what that time was and who those people were and where they came from, which stretches back into the 40s and then into the 30s and the 20s. And she also said, in talking about just life in America, she said, well, you know, Robert and I, you know, we lived in the country for almost our entire lives. We didn't live in the city. And those two things, it seems like a random response to what you're saying, but it sort of opened up a way to think about these American lives and their trajectory through it. The fact that these two people wound up in San Francisco at a particular time and then left very quickly. And that in Aileen's case, she's sort of a product of post-war suburbia, and in Robert's case, he's really a strange product of like the American war machine, but also obviously the Depression and the sort of urban world around that and the music of it and all of that. And then also, I was spending a lot of time in the Central Valley of California because I was working at a museum there, and that's where Robert and Aileen lived for many, many years. And the more time I spent there and the more time I talked in particular to Craig McNamara, who is Robert McNamara's son and was very close to Robert and Aileen. And I realized that there was a whole other way to think about these lives, that for somebody like Craig, who grew up, you know, literally playing under John F. Kennedy's desk at the White House, that 15 years later, he's hanging out with Crumb, but they're not hippies. They're just trying to raise their families in Central Valley and kind of watching this extremist right-wing thing encroach on them. It opened up different ways to think about the country. And I'm not, you know, I'm like sitting here and there's Kai. So I don't know, like, I'm not, there are times when I thought, well, I don't really know anything about America, but but I could sort of suss it out through talking to them and really thinking a lot about where they had come from and how they navigated, because they're such unusual stories. All these people in this book are unique, of course, but uniquely thoughtful about the paths they took, and also the sort of strange off-ramps that so many of their peers took.
Well, and I think this is going away from my initial questions, but what I think we as people who work with artists, creatives, there are the stories of what America is and how it got here, and then there are the lives that are lived and the pursuits that happen alongside and during. And in some ways, for me, those stories are the truer stories, or they demonstrate the effects of the decisions of the people we think of when we think of great biographies. And
That's right,
I think it was that combination of the lives being lived, the eking out a creative pursuit in the margins, on the sides, I could relate to through my work with artists, but also this sort of Woody Allen, I don't want to be a member of a club that,
the
like
club,
this kind of quality of, oh, I'm going to make it, but then it turned into something else, so I got to leave because and that observational, slightly from the outside while being at the center quality that I think has this capacity to tell us so much about history and this place.
Yeah, I mean, I have always been drawn to marginal artists for whatever reason, and Crumb is a great case because he, like you said, Robert's sort of the ultimate observer, but he, at various times, has been ubiquitous in the culture. So it's a very strange combination of someone who, like with hippie culture, it's 1968, and he's hanging out with Janis Joplin, and it's the Haight-Ashbury, but his hair is relatively short. He's mostly interested in comic books and records and women.
And he's wearing a suit.
And he's wearing a suit, and he looks like a Depression-era salesman, and he is not interested in going with the tide. He goes to the Human Being the year before, and he's totally alienated. Everybody else is having a great time. He's annoyed.
I identified with him so much.
I do too. I mean, that was one of the stranger things, is identifying with him, because
we'll get there.
Yeah. But yeah, that was what was so great about following him through the century, is that he comes in contact with so much because he's a naturally curious person, and he's always there to talk. So in any social situation, as long as it's sort of one-on-one, he wants to know everything about who you are, what you're doing, what does that mean, how does that work, who do you report to, what's going on, and so he finds himself on the margins, yes, but then working for a greeting card company, which is completely mainstream. And, that stuff was distributed all over the country in hundreds of thousands of cards. And, then his underground comics become mainstream. And he sort of ebbs and flows, but he comes in contact with so much because he's never wanting to hoard power or stay at the center or make a bid to be relevant. It's all just sort of following his own instincts and his own curiosity. It's kind of astonishing that way, actually, to remain so open. I mean, open in a way. Open. He's wide open. And so that'll take you all kinds of places, good and bad, and in the middle. And it was...
Well, so back to the original genesis of the, pun intended, of the project, when you had this idea to kind of write a history of comics through one figure, was it always him, or?
Yeah. It was always him, because I've been obsessed with him since I was like 13, and had been reading him the whole time. And when I started this in 2018, I also realized that I had some comics, some art, whatever, stopped growing with you. it fades out. And he had kept growing with me. And so I was still really curious about him. I really wanted to know more. And he still had a lot to give me in a way that not a lot does. So I knew it was him. And it was just a question of whether or not he was going to say yes.
Well, right, so now can you
Tell the
tell
story.
the story?
Yeah. So I went over to see him. I wrote to him and said, "Here's how I want to do it. This is really going to contextualize you in the history of comics, and you're not going to have to teach me much." And so he said, "Well, if you're serious, come over to France and let's talk." And then 2 days before I was supposed to go the first time, I choked on a piece of lamb at my dad's 75th birthday party.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Dad. Went to the emergency room, spent the night there. It's a recurring problem. No one give me lamb. And I finally went a month later and spent the weekend with him. And he said, "Yeah, you can do it as long as you air out the criticisms of racism and misogyny about my work. You have to give that ample research and time in the book." And I said, "Okay, fine." I think he thought that might freak me out, but it was completely liberating.
Had you thought much about that part of it before making the ask?
I don't know. I don't think so, honestly. No, not really, because I was still sort of a lot of Crumb and a lot of sort of reading Crumb over the years is you start to take that, or I started to take that stuff in stride. Where I remember when I first got Head Comics when I was 14, and I took it to school freshman year of high school and like Xerox parts of it and put it up in my little area, like my locker, and people were like, "This is horrible. What are you doing?" And it didn't really occur to me that this stuff was pretty rough. Like if my son did that, I'd be like,
I
"What
was
are you
just
doing?"
going to ask you.
What's going on? But
And then I was also thinking that he has access.
he has
so much work.
no interest.
Oh, well, yeah,
It's
yeah.
interesting, actually. Yeah. Now that, he's not really interested in Crumb. He liked Crumb. He sat next to him at dinner and they talked, but no interest in the race. I really wanted to look at transgressive stuff when I was that age, and I think partly because I was and remain fairly square. It's like that Flaubert line, like it's just all up here. And Robert really scratched that itch, and yeah, I think a lot of the people that follow him very closely over the years sort of develop an immunity to the more difficult aspects, which doesn't do him any favors. There's a sort of sense of like, get off my lawn, it's all cool, let's stop talking about it aspect, and that's not helpful.
Well, and sort of weaving that line of conversation into process, we had talked before that I was curious, so much has changed and continues to change in the conversation around artists, their personal lives, all of these things from when you first made the invitation through the writing of the book and to now. And being a curator whose work has to go on public view, who knows that we will get comments and criticism and has lived through that in a public way as well, I'm curious how that affected your process, how that comes in and out of not the writing itself, the final product, but the process of the writing.
It was strange because there's part of me that's suspicious of the amount of attention it's gotten right now, because it definitely feels like if Kamala had won, I'm not sure that it would have gotten such a great reception. But I have no idea. I could be overthinking that. Who knows? But I thought about it a lot because I knew that I had to deal with it. And I also knew that I wasn't really I'm a fairly sensible, down the middle thinker. And I'm a little bit like halfway to being a kind of freedom of expression extremist, but only halfway, so I'm not really an extremist. But, you know, of course I feel like he should be able to publish whatever he wants, the end. But it was important to start thinking really hard about, well, okay, he can publish whatever he wants, but people can react to it however they want as well. And so taking that into account, how do I offer sort of not guidelines, but ways of looking at this work that would be helpful in unpacking the race aspect? And my initial inclination, which was ill-advised on my own part, I was only advising myself, was to sort of put it with a whole swath of what a friend of mine called like well-intentioned white guy racism of the 1960s. You know, there's like...
I feel like there's like a trash can somewhere. Yeah.
There is, yeah, on my bookshelves. Yeah, I mean, there was Robert Downey, you know, there was Robert Nelson. It's weird, they're all named Robert, but there's a lot of that, of like well-intentioned critiques of racism that perpetuated racism. Like Robert Nelson's film "Oh, Dem Watermelons" is like, I think 15 years ago was seen as like a scathing examination of racism in America. Now you look at it and you're like, oh, that didn't work. So I knew it couldn't be that. And it helped a lot that I was writing it at a time of extreme sensitivity, because my editor really pushed me. You know, I remember I wrote somewhere in an early draft, I said like, this is difficult to look at, but art can't hurt anyone. And Kathy wrote, are you sure about that, Dan? Are you sure? And so I thought, oh, good point. Maybe it can. And so then how do we deal with that? And I got really good guidelines talking to artists. I talked to a guy named Dewey Crumpler, a show I co-curated in New York, who had been a very young helper for the Black Panthers in the late 1960s. So I talked to Ishmael Reed, who was extremely helpful, who had been at the Village Voice when Robert was, shortly before Robert was drawing for them. I talked to people. That was the only way through it, just talking and talking and talking. And I got a very interesting education in different lived experiences of seeing Robert's work from a number of women who were around at that time in the Bay Area. And that was head-turning and kind of mind-expanding, because there were all sorts of reactions to it, and most of them were positive, and a lot of them were sort of, well, this needed to come out. We see it now, that it's sort of horrifying. But at the time, it's that sort of white guy, it's that well-intentioned misogyny. You know, it's all part of this stuff coming out. It's just how you talk about it now and how it can be taken out of context that I think is most important. So it took a lot of navigation, because it's not my natural instinct to do that much kind of excavating of my own consciousness to sort of get at something. It didn't come naturally, but but then it felt really good. It was like jogging. You know?
I have that same experience.
Yeah.
Do you feel like in doing that excavating, you are in the book, or you are more in the book than you thought you would have been going into it?
Yeah, I'm much more in the book than I ever would have thought. But I'm in the book. I didn't want someone to feel me in the book until the very end, but it reflects my own thinking around all this stuff more than I thought was really possible without using the eye. Like that took me by surprise, how much of it is me. But a lot of it is also Crumb.
Well, and then that's what I was going to ask about.
Strange.
So in addition to navigating all of this, you're not only writing a biography of someone who's alive. I want to get into the authorized, unauthorized question, but also someone who's obsessive who's obsessive,
Yeah.
who's obsessively documented everything, told every story, recorded everything. Not being a biographer, but having done a lot of archival research, I feel like you kind of dream of the middle. Like, you don't want nothing because you want some crumbs to go on, but it seems to me like the volume I would just collapse under the weight of it. How did you get
So
through the
Robert, yeah, I
volume?
mean, Robert buried me in paper. Like, he definitely, thousands and thousands of pages of correspondence. And some of that, like, at first it was a total boon. It was like, oh my God, here it all is. And then I realized, oh God, it's so much.
Thank God he didn't have email.
No, he does.
But I mean,
Back
all
then.
all the years.
The email thing was even worse in some ways because he corresponds with certain people email only, and it's endless, the printouts, the email print. He prints out everything. So everything is printed, and it's all there, perfectly categorized, but it's so much that it's hard to know where the narrative is. And the good news is that I am still, tragically, and was curious enough to want to read it all. Like, I actually wanted to know, and I was obsessed with a lot of the characters that were coming in and out of his life, and I wanted to know more and more and more about some of these people who have completely slipped away. Like his best friend, Marty Pauls, who's just gone. I mean, the only traces of him are in Robert's home. And so I enjoyed that, and then I had to pull back and figure out who the main characters were. And then I could just thread those and deal with it that way. Like, okay, I need to know where Marty is in 1972 and how he dies in 1980, whatever, and where he is. And so then I'm just threading it through and kind of touching down at those places. But it was a lot, and at times it was extremely confusing because, you know, there could be a whole chapter just on Robert's conspiracy theories. There could be endless chapters on his sexual preferences. There's so much that he went so deep on, but that wasn't the kind of book it needed to be. Like, it couldn't be an 800-page book. I knew it had to be readable and legible and follow these people through. So that kind of saved me in a way, but I did spend an insane amount of time reading, just pages and pages and pages. And he's a very good writer. So that helped and hurt because it was also like, oh, I want to keep reading, but I'm at page, 500 of 1,000 of his one correspondence with Dr. Shelley Rosen. It's time to stop. It was a little too much fun at times.
And was that all in France? How did...
I did the only thing I really regret about the process was I would go to France and I'd have a certain amount of time because I just can't, I couldn't just like set up shop and live there, although it would have been nice. So I'd go and spend days photographing documents and then bring it all home and look at it on screen. I couldn't really spend the time to read because there's just too much. If I spent time reading, then I would lose time interviewing him. And the best way to interview him was in person. On the phone, I would ask him questions, very, very specific questions about dates and documents. But on the phone, I can feel his attention wandering at about the 20-minute mark. And I also see how he talks on the phone. I know I've observed him talking on the phone, so I know that he's standing up in the hallway, looking longingly at his record room and drafting table, wanting to be doing something else than talking on the phone.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. So I knew I had to be there to really get at the. Aileen was great on the phone. Aileen would just talk. But
I mean, I'm not going to stereotype her, but
yeah, exactly. Yes.
I can.
Yeah. Oh yeah. But no, it was a process of a lot of sifting. It was really strange to do that, and also strange to do it with somebody who was alive. I kind of had to pretend he was dead sometimes, just to get him. Well, Robert is one of the most charismatic people I've ever met, which is unlikely if you sort of read the caricature of him. But when you're in front of him, and it's funny, Molly found this too, like, who wrote the New York Times profile, like, Robert looks at you very intently and is asking very probing questions and is extremely present. And that is extremely draining to be around and to feel. I've had like, I described it to Carol Dunham, and he said he had the same he's only had the same experience with Jasper Johns, which actually makes a lot of sense. It's these people that have spent decades in their bodies and minds, like really turning it over and over and over. And so I imagine it's probably what it's like encountering someone who's meditated for 50 years only. You know, it was really, so I had to kind of fight his consciousness off sometimes. It was strange. It remains a very strange
and also
experience.
the consciousness is in the work. So
Yes,
even if
it's
he
all
is,
over me.
even if he
Yeah,
was
yeah.
dead in a way, you might have had a similar
Yes.
wrestling. But speaking of the body and being there, you said at the beginning that part of why you wanted to do this long form comics work was that nobody had really written about what it's like to make comics. And that, you know, for me, of course, being a lover of material culture, visual material culture, your descriptions of the implements, of the paper, of the process, I felt almost like I could hear and feel, I'm not being hyperbolic, but hear and feel the pen, the ink moving across the paper. Did you get a chance to watch him?
So yeah, I cheated. I had him demonstrate different pen techniques for me. Not cheated. Is that cheating? No? Judges? I asked him to do demonstrations. I had him demonstrate a brush, a speedball pen for lettering, and a crow quill, and a rapidograph.
Did you try them?
And I filmed it. Yes. And he showed me, he said, well, you try, and I tried all of them. So yeah, and I filmed it, and I would watch it again and again and again so that I could really understand it. Because and I should say, like, David Michaelis's biography of Charles Schulz does a great job of that. But
You
there
weren't
aren't many others.
disparaging anyone.
Yeah,
But I
feel bad.
was going to
I
say,
immediately feel guilty.
I think it's an interesting thing to think about in the context of this room and what it means to write about somebody's practice that is not your own. And I think it's been so central to my work as a curator to at least have minimal experience with the materials that the artists I'm working with are using, because we're so good as people who engage in the life of the mind about forgetting about the body. And I
Right.
really, of course you can't forget about the body in Crumb's work,
Right.
but you brought the body in so many different ways that I was grateful for as a reader.
Well, I was fascinated by his way of moving through the world. It's like when we would go hiking together.
In a suit?
Jesus Christ, yeah. Actually, yes. I was not wearing this.
I didn't
but
think
he
so.
was wearing, I was like, in shorts and
Your
sneakers.
your
and,
descriptions of him
some-
clearing brush
Yeah.
in France in a suit had me sweating.
I know. It's unbelievable. He is a very physical person. For somebody who has described himself as like a brain in a jar, he is not that in my experience. The hiking, just the way he walks through a place. And when he was in New York a month ago, I realized we were walking down Fifth Avenue from like 23rd to Union Square. And it took us like an hour because he's stopping and looking at everything and also wanting to pick things up. He's a fascinatingly physical person, and Aileen was too. Aileen was, and thinking about also how they lived in the Central Valley, which is, in New York we can kind of forget that we have bodies in some weird way, because you're just like in steel tubes or whatever. But I thought a lot about the Central Valley because you just sweat all the time, and they were living in such kind of extreme conditions in some ways. Like, okay, a migrant shack, or using a steel tub for a wash tub. Just these strange things that you don't really think of living here in particular. So yeah, his physicality was really important to me, and also the fact that that so much of growing up and being alienated was a result of sort of physical defects, or his older brother Charles getting beat up because he was chasing people, pretending he was Long John Silver, or Robert not being drafted because he had a sort of concave chest. All these sort of things that you kind of forget about when you're just looking at the comics, or you forget about because we're not supposed to think of, like, quote unquote, like nerds as having bodies. But he's a very physical guy, and and yeah, drawing that way is hard. Like, it is really hard work. I'm still kind of amazed by his ability to do that. Just to pull that pen across the page is wild.
Well, and I think for all those reasons and all of your bringing in of the history of comics, fleshing out the cast of characters around him, so much of what we share is this interest in these other forms that maybe the literary world and the art world have sort of abandoned. And yet they are in keeping with both, and using the techniques and innovations of both. And I think we talked about this before, but his absolute investment in the form, and dedication to, but manipulation of, at the end of the day, I think you just strongly made a case of why he's, as you say in the beginning, one of the greatest artists of the 20th century.
Yeah, I'll buy that. Yeah. I will still buy that. Yeah. I mean, it's such a strange form because it shouldn't be a problem. Like, it is a container. It can contain so much, but on the other hand, it only existed as essentially, like, in comic book form, initially just children's entertainment, and then kind of lurid pulp stuff for GIs and juvenile delinquents. But yeah, he is very dedicated to the form, but the interesting thing to think about is, there's Art Spiegelman and Crumb as sort of the twin figures of, post 1960 comics, let's say. And Spiegelman is a formalist in the sense that he's actually engaged with the modern contemporary avant-garde, and trying to take things apart and put them back together and do all that. Robert's like a traditionalist formalist. He's not gonna, move you around the page in a crazy way or break up time in that way that Spiegelman does. And of course, Spiegelman's great genius is his ability to take all of that formalist knowledge and then tell what seems like a straightforward story in Mouse, but actually it's operating on like 35 different levels that you can just keep reading and rereading, and then he does it again. Robert is operating on a much more I'm talking to you in a matter-of-fact way level, but it's all in the detail of his drawing. He's telling you so much without ever slowing you down, which is a magical thing that he does in comics. And it's funny because he's pulling from people who do slow you down. Like, he's pulling from Hal Foster, who did Prince Valiant, which is a wonderful comic, but is not rhythmic in the way that Robert is. It slows you down. You read and then you look. Robert is much more in keeping with this guy Carl Barks, who did all the great Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge stories. where he's moving you through, but showing you something, but the words are telling you that you should be looking over to the left, like squint your eyes and you realize it's a story about divorce.
I think you mentioned somewhere about the subliminal messaging that's coming through in the details, and I think
so much. Yeah. He's guiding you through so much just by showing you, how a window frames someone. It's that kind of thing that I think led the way for a lot of people to come after, and also, both contemporary artists and cartoonists and whomever else. There's this sort of unbelievable swath of people who took, people say that musicians made their careers out of a single song on the White Album. I feel that way about different periods of Crumb's work, where people took certain things and went all the way with that one thing. Somebody like Spiegelman, like I write in the book, and we've talked about, saw what Crumb was doing and just had to do something else entirely. Like, did not take the one song, just kind of made a different record.
And the Spiegelman versus Crumb is maybe a further conversation.
It's a great conversation. And what's funny is that they're more alike than not. But it's a fascinating thing because they both come from the same father in a way, which is Harvey Kurtzman, who's one of the great kind of unsung geniuses of the 20th century for inventing MAD.
Well, maybe that's your next book.
No. It is. I do want to do that, actually, but the next one is Jack Kirby.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I want to make sure you all have time for your questions and thoughts, and my watch is telling me we're about there. So if anybody, we have a microphone over here.
Yes. Questions or thoughts?
Sometimes people say questions and then what is shared are not questions. So I would rather just acknowledge the conversational nature of a Q&A.
Yes.
I have two questions. One, did you have a particular model among all the biographies that you read? You mentioned the Schulz biography, but I wonder if there is another or a particular one. And the other thing I'm interested in is what seems to me Crumb's fundamental conservatism. And I wonder if you agree with that, and if you brought it out in any way in the book.
That's a great question. The first one's easy. The second one's harder. The model in my head was Shaky by Jimmy McDonough, the Neil Young biography, and because it remains for me the best book I've ever read about the collateral damage an artist does, the high body count around an artist, and also body count, I mean psychologically and otherwise, and also the best accounting of all the things around an artist that's required for that art to reach a public. I've never seen it done better. And it's just a fabulous book. The conservatism is such a great question, because a friend, that has been put to me before. And the answer is, on some level, yes. Yeah, he's conservative in the sense that this is a guy who really thinks that, I shouldn't put words in his mouth, but more or less, let's say, potentially thinks that abstract expressionism and everything non-figurative after World War II is sort of a CIA op.
But don't put words in his
mouth. And also, basically, let's just say a scam and bullshit. And that's a conservative point of view. So yeah, I mean, he likes Reginald Marsh, as do I, Paul Cadmus, fun, but within that, go ahead.
Well, I was just, it's such an interesting question, it's such an interesting answer to the question, and I think what's fascinating is there is a way of looking at that as conservative. And then I actually had marked a page in here about progress versus nostalgia. And as somebody who has spent their life in contemporary art, which comes out of this legacy of
which he thinks is complete bullshit.
yeah, let's have a drink and have that conversation, which has propelled itself on the cult of the new and the cult of the personality. And so I also love what you said about the Neil Young biography. I too am skeptical of progress for progress's sake, and I too am interested in the less celebrated and forgotten figures of any art form, be it regional music or, visual art. And so I think from my perspective, it's just a both and. Like, I think you can be that little C conservative and also be doing the project can be something, yes.
Yes. I mean, I thought you were going to say something slightly different, which is like Paul Cadmus could be read as conservative, but what he's doing in that conservative approach to painting
is not conservative at all.
Is wild.
Yeah.
It's just really nuts and amazing. So, yeah, I mean, but I think aesthetically, yeah, conservative. And I didn't hear you.
I'm sorry. Not only formally, but the ideas, the social, what's reflected socially in the comics.
It can be conservative, but also not. Like I wouldn't label them one way or the other, especially now when it's much more. Because there are times when it's really far-reaching, kind of spiritual searching or questioning of authority and all sorts of things. And then there are times that there are comics that I'm not a huge fan of that are sort of complaints against, modern music. There's all of that. I mean, the beauty of his body of work is that you can tack labels onto so much of it, but taken in its entirety, it's too complex to sort of put into any box. And every time you do something, you realize you see something else, and you're like, oh yeah, no, he's not that. He's just his own, like, galaxy.
Another question? We're going to go back there, and then we'll go to you next.
Hi. Kind of two questions. This is not my question, but what was the biography you mentioned? I didn't hear the title of the. You mentioned the biography that kind of was your. I don't want to.
Shaky by Jimmy McDonough.
Oh, okay.
Biography of Neil Young.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I feel like such a nerd.
So this is my question. When you initially reached out to Crumb with the idea to do this book, if he had said no way, what would you have done?
Oh, I would have not done it. I mean, that would have been that. I can't. I'm not like I don't. I take no pleasure in trying to like shoehorn my way into something. Like I was going to make the pitch and pitch hard, but I don't do. It doesn't that kind of thing where it's like, well, I'll do it anyway. Nah, that's no fun. I don't want that karmic load.
Hi.
Hi.
I am very eager to read your book because I spent some time with the Crumbs in the mid-'90s. I met them at the Jerusalem Film Festival.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And at that time, Aileen was absolutely beside herself because the Terry Zwigoff film brought unwanted fame to them, and it was immediately apparent that this was sort of not true. So I wondered how he sits with fame.
Wait, which part wasn't true? The unwanted fame?
Well, the fact it was a conceit, clearly. She had written about it in the New Yorker, and then
So true.
she was invited to the Jerusalem Film Festival. I had a film there, so we became buddies. And as I said, we spent time together. And it felt like it was a double-edged sword, this fame thing. So I wonder how it sits now.
That's a great question. It's so, yeah. I mean, one of the strange things about biography is you get asked about how people feel that are not yourself. So, you know, it's funny. He's so funny about that. Aileen, I think that Terry's film, which is, you know, one of the great portraits of an artist ever, really freaked them out in the sense that they'd been living a really quiet life. That said, both of them, Terry said something funny to me, like when Crumb was coming over, he said, well, you know, it's the adulation tour. You know, he needs to come out and receive his public every so often. And I think that's kind of true. And I think it is a double-edged sword, but I think it suited their narrative and their comics and their whole thing to be like, oh my God, Terry manipulated us and da 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 da. But Robert and Aileen, you know, you don't get to be Robert Crumb and Aileen Kaminsky Crumb just by stumbling around saying yes to everything. I mean, Aileen was very smart. Robert is very smart. These are very sophisticated, smart people who, while not, and that doesn't mean that everything's conscious. It doesn't mean that when they wrote that then they did that New Yorker comic. They did a New Yorker comic kind of, you know, being kind of hysterical about the fame that the movie had brought. But it should be noted that they did that in the New Yorker. And hello. So
Whining to the whiniest
yeah,
folk.
I mean, whining. So, you know, and I don't think it's calculated. I think they were two people that really lived in the moment, and however Robert feels in the moment, he might in the moment feel like, oh my God, Dan's book is a fucking nightmare. Why did he do? But he might not. And I think it's all kind of when you catch them, and it's not calculated. I don't think it's a put on, any part of it at all. But it is hilarious because everything they did, not everything they did, but they never really shied away if they went to Jerusalem.
Right.
You know, they show up.
The story was that Leah von Leer, who was the head of the Jerusalem Film Festival, contacted them and said, your nightmare has come true. You're invited.
Yeah, yeah. And they could have said no, just like they could have not been in the New Yorker. You know, yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky with people. People are funny. People are funny.
Other questions?
I actually just started reading the book over the weekend, and I was surprised by, I guess I'd never had really thought of comics and Mad Magazine specifically as this satire and contextualizing everything within the frame of this vehicle for change before.
About Mad in particular?
Yeah.
I know. The Mad that most of us grew up with, I mean, most of us under the age of like 60 grew up with, was kind of like was pretty watered down. But when it started in the early 1950s, and it was created by really Jews from New York who were really coming out of like a real Yiddishkeit sensibility, who were working at the like lowest end of the publishing totem pole, like one step above pornography, below everything else. It's full of rage, and it's full of like hysteria and hilarity and surrealism. It is truly a strange thing to encounter now. And so, yeah, I mean, I think they were really rebelling.
I actually saw those really old magazines because my father used to collect them. My dad was 6 years younger than our Crumb, actually. So it's really interesting to start reading the book because there's so many bizarre connections between Crumb's family and my own.
Oh.
Like really bizarre, like mental illness, schizophrenia, like war. My father was the only like mentally stable one, but but it was really interesting because I'm so sad that I can't talk to my father about it because he loved satire and irony, and I think that that's where like Mad Magazine really informed his worldview too.
Yeah.
And he had these like amazing Mad magazines from the 50s, which I looked at as a child, which I think also created my own work.
Yeah.
But it's
That's
like,
good.
I don't even know. Unfortunately, I think someone threw those out along the way because they were my grandmother's house. But
Classic story.
it was really interesting, just different snips of the book, like the Catholic education. My father hated the nuns and he was traumatized. And you were saying like it took him years to
Yeah.
get over the trauma of like the Catholic school education. And it's just really interesting to find these very personal parallels, which I wouldn't have seen. And it's
Yeah.
interesting too, because now that my father passed away like 20 months ago, I'm thinking of it personally, but I'm also thinking of this time and milieu that has shaped his worldview.
Well, and that, your question opens up something for me, and then maybe we'll have time for one more question. We talked a little bit about, I'm Jewish, if that part hasn't been made clear yet.
Me too.
And we talked a little bit in our prep talk about, and you write this in the book, about his sort of collecting of Jewish friends and acquaintances. And, and you know, I kept thinking about this. I think I also always thought he was.
A lot of people do.
And so sort of didn't know what to make of that. And your question and your answer about the Yiddishkeit embedded in early Mad, I mean, is that where that comes from for him? Is that...
I think it's a big chunk of it, honestly. I think, you know, that it was a comic book when it was a comic book and then a magazine when he was into it. And that is really so Jewish. It is crazy, and specifically New York Jewish. And he was obsessed with it.
That's the other
and
thing. I always
remained obsessed
assumed
with it.
he spent more time in New York than he
Spent
did.
very, very little time in New York. But Harvey Kurtzman was his mentor, and he idolized Kurtzman and followed him very, very closely, like followed his career very closely. And Kurtzman really tried to bring him along. And I think the sort of foundational other father figures for Crumb were Harvey Kurtzman and then a guy named Woody Gelman, who was another Jew from New York, who was an early animator and then ran the creative department of Topps Bubblegum. So the guy responsible for Bazooka Joe, Mars Attacks, all these things. And I think that imprinted on Robert really, really strongly. And then his very close friend, you know, Terry Zwigoff, a Jew from Chicago. His father was a Garmento, and Aileen. I think all this stuff just. Sometimes I think people are born wanting to receive a sensibility. Like,
That's really
I've
interesting.
wondered about that for myself even. Like, why am I so drawn to it? Just it like fits, and I think with Robert, Mad, and Kurtzman fit in a way that maybe very little else did. Because the guys doing the other comic books he was obsessed with were all Gentiles. Karl Barks, Walt Kelly, John Stanley. But they were all sort of urban depression coded. So that kind of locks in as well. So yeah, Robert, yeah, that's interesting.
One final question.
Yeah, quick comment and then a question. One, I do have to push back a little on the Mad Magazine comment. I think Al Felsi and Harvey Kurtzman were both brilliant in what they did, and I discovered Mad first, obviously, when Al Felsi did it, and I thought it was brilliant. They did a lot of really great political satire, but then later discovered Kurtzman's work, and I was amazed in all of his work as well. So just a comment about that. But real quick, I did get to meet Robert and Aileen a few times, and actually interviewed Robert a while back. And I think he's a pretty affable guy, but he doesn't necessarily warm up to everyone around him. And I was curious, how did you get him to be comfortable enough for you to do this project? I remember when I met him, I discussed Mad Magazine, and I'm also a big blues fan, so I love like Reverend Gary Davis, all those
Oh yeah, so that does it, yeah.
artists. So that kind of like helped us engage in a better conversation. What initially got him to warm up to working with you?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I think it was two, I think it was two things. One is the first time, I had met Robert initially because I had done a show, an exhibition at a gallery of female cartoonists that was like in response to the Masters of American Comics show, which toured the country. It was all male, so I organized an all-female show, and Aileen was in it, and that led to her having a solo show. So he was sort of positively inclined towards me because of that. But I went over with my wife, Elisa, who's a much warmer person than I am, maybe. So that helped to sort of keep it from being just like the two nerds in a room. So that sort of broke the ice, just Elisa's warmth. And but we talked about comic books, just like, same. Like, we talked about Karl Barks for a really long time. And then Walt Kelly, and then John Stanley. And we looked at comic books, and then, so it's like, it took about 24 hours. It took 24 hours, and then he said yes after a lot of comic book talk, which was a lot of fun, because he's really fun to talk about comics with. I am also fun to talk about comics with. If anybody wants to talk about comics.
And if you would like to talk about comics, I believe Dan will be
or Neil Young.
signing his book and talking about comics and Neil Young.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank
This
you.
was a real treat.